So there's the title. You probably have all heard the term Anthropocene. We live in this whole new geologic epoch because of the intensity of our interaction with our underlying ecological life support system. This means business as usual is no longer an option. I think if our goal is really to create a sustainable and desirable future, we need to think and act differently. And that means we need to build a new economy that's based on a different goal, on the goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, recognizing that we are a part of this natural system. We have to understand the whole system in a more integrated way, and we have to get beyond the mindless pursuit of GDP growth. So to create this sustainable well-being, we have to have an adequate vision, first of all, of how the world is, how our scientific understanding of not only the biophysical world, but also the social world and what actually does contribute to well-being. And it's much more than simply consumption and production. And also we need a better understanding of how this world is interconnected. But we also need a better vision of how we would like the world to be. What kind of world do we really want? What is the economy for? And I think that's a fundamental change. To achieve this, I think we need appropriate tools and analytical techniques. We need more systems thinking and modeling. We have to understand this whole interconnected, complex system. And we need better implementation strategies, including new kinds of institutions and societal therapy, as I'll say. I think we are addicted and locked into the current system. That's why we haven't changed. Even though I think there's broad consensus, really, that the current trajectory is leading us over the edge of a cliff. You've probably seen some version of this idea of planetary boundaries. There are fundamental ecological constraints. We're probably exceeding several of those planetary boundaries, certainly with respect to climate change and biodiversity loss and the nitrogen cycle, and several others are rapidly approaching the safe operating space within our ecological life support system. We know that there are potential major tipping points in the climate system, in the global ecosystem. The world's a complex, non-adaptive system. There are thresholds, tipping points, and surprises. We can't project things, into the future in a nice linear way. And you've probably heard of some of these, at least: the ice sheets melting, the Amazon rainforest burning down, the changes in ENSO. But any of these tipping points could really cause things to change much more quickly. So this is the way that these environmental problems are usually presented. We are heading for disaster, and that's an inconvenient truth. That's not the movie that a lot of people are lining up to go see, because it's too easy to believe in the reassuring lie that everything's going to be fine. I think, however, that to make this transition, we need a third movie. We need one that is based on a positive vision and a new narrative about what a sustainable and desirable economy in society and the rest of nature could actually look like, and recognizing the embeddedness of the economy in society and the rest of nature. So we have to have a different view of what the economy is and what it's for. We have to stay within planetary boundaries, but we also have to create the elements of well-being and quality of life, and stay within the sustainable and desirable, safe and just donut, as Kate Raworth has called it. Ecological economics is an attempt to do just that, and it's a different approach that's based on trying to be a transdisciplinary understanding of both the science and the management of our whole world. So it's based on these three integrated questions or goals, to maintain an ecologically sustainable scale or size or magnitude of the economic subsystems, to stay within planetary boundaries, to create a socially fair distribution of resources, both within the current generation of humans, but also between current and future generations, and between humans and other species. So this whole idea of social fairness is key. And to have an economically efficient allocation of resources. How do we use our assets most effectively? And recognizing that many, if not most of those assets are outside the market. They're not currently being allocated in anything like an efficient way. So we're not economically efficient, certainly not fair, certainly not sustainable. How do we change that? It also recognizes that we have these four basic types of assets that need to interact in order to create sustainable well-being. Our conventional built capital, but also human capital, individual people, and not just their labor, but their health, their well-being, individual well-being, their social capital, all of the interactions among individuals, both formal and informal. So our cultures, our institutions, the market itself is a form of social capital. That social capital has been eroding rapidly. It's also based on trust among individuals. And finally, our natural capital, everything else in the world that we didn't have to build or maintain, the free gifts of nature. Ecosystem services then are the contribution of natural capital in that complex interaction to produce sustainable well-being. And we've estimated that the value of those ecosystem services is huge. In this study we did back in 1997, we estimated it to be significantly larger than global GDP at the time. However, one thing we didn't control was what they put on the cover of the magazine. We did make the cover, that was good, but they said pricing the planet. And we didn't really mean pricing as much as we meant valuing the planet, recognizing that many, if not most, of these ecosystem services are public goods, community property. They're not marketed and shouldn't be marketed, but they still, in very real ways, contribute to our sustainable well-being. So how do we estimate that relative contribution and recognize how big it is? More recently, we estimated how that value had changed between 1997 and 2011, and estimated that over that period, because of land use change, desertification, loss of coral reefs, loss of tropical forests, et cetera, and better understanding of some of the contributions of these ecosystem services, we're losing about $20 trillion a year in the value of those services. Sounds bad, but it can be turned around. Depending on what sort of scenario we choose to pursue going into the future. The conventional market forces business as usual means continued decline. We could arrest that with appropriate policy reform. Fortress world makes it even worse. But if we pursue a great transition scenario, then I think we can recover many of those ecosystem services, rebuild, regenerate, and change things for the better. However, we have been, pursuing this GDP, in a mindless way, and we know that if you plot GDP per capita versus life satisfaction, you get plots that look something like this. This one's a bit old, but I think this has not changed significantly. There's a rapid increase at first, but beyond a certain point, additional GDP, additional consumption and production doesn't really improve people's mean life satisfaction. Why is that? Well, GDP was never designed as a measure of societal well-being. It really only measures economic activity, marketed production and consumption. Even the architects of GDP, and this is one of them, Simon Kuznets, warned against using GDP for that purpose. The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined by GDP. So when we talk about goals for more growth, you got to talk about growth of what and for what. So what is the economy for, and how do we change that definition to mean what we really want is growth of well-being, and not just any old well-being, but sustainable well-being, something that's going to last. We've known about this problem for a long time, as I said. This was a famous speech by Robert Kennedy back in 1968, where he recognized that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. So how do we get beyond that? I think one thing that we can do is begin to measure the things that do contribute to well-being, and show how that doesn't correspond with growth in GDP. And one alternative of many, there are literally hundreds, I would say, out there of alternative measures of well-being. This is just one example that I think is quite compelling in the results that it produces, called the Genuine Progress Indicator. And it starts with personal consumption expenditures, which are a major component of GDP, but then it weights them by income distribution. So it does take into account the fact that if all of GDP were going to a small number of people, which it currently is to a large extent, that's not producing as much welfare as if it were more equitably distributed. And the distinction between welfare, well-being, and simply income is one that this picks up. It adds a few things that are left out of GDP, like the value of household labor and the value of volunteer work. Obviously, good things, but they're not marketed, so they're not included. And it subtracts a bunch of things that really should be counted as costs, not as benefits. The cost of commuting, the loss of leisure time, the cost of crime, family breakdown, a whole range of natural capital components, air and water pollution, etc. This has been done for many countries around the world, and this was a synthesis that we put together to create a global estimate of GDP per capita versus GPI per capita. And you can see that even though GDP has continued to climb over this whole period from 1950 up until a few years ago, GPI has leveled off and actually declined. So we've moved from a period of economic growth to a period of uneconomic growth. The economy is growing, but it's not actually improving well-being. And I think this distinction is really a sign of the level of our addiction to the growth paradigm. We're continuing to pursue that, even though we know that it's not improving societal well-being. GPI is not the perfect measure. I think there's a lot of work going on around the world in doing better measures of well-being and sustainability. And I think that's a great thing. But they all sort of point to the fact that increasing GDP is not necessarily the way to go. So to create this sustainable well-being economy, I think is first of all going to require breaking our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption in many cases, and recognizing that it is an addiction. We're locked into this system because of the positive short-term reinforcements. But we recognize that the long-term implications are not positive. And so what kind of therapy is it going to take to overcome this addiction? And I'll point out that, let's see, that probably one of the most effective therapies at the individual scale is this idea of motivational interviewing, where instead of confronting addicts with their problem, they start with a positive discussion of their goals, their motives, and the kinds of life that they want for themselves. We know that confronting addicts usually leads to a denial kind of reaction, and we're getting the same sort of thing with society when we focus completely on the problems and that we have to change. So how do we create a more positive discussion of the kind of world that we really want? The obvious analogy at the societal scale is how do we build a shared vision of the kind of world that we all want? As the famous philosopher and baseball player Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up somewhere else. So how do we create a better shared vision? The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think are a great step in the right direction, although somebody has already pointed out economic growth is still one of them. I think there was a big controversy over that. I think it really should be, economic prosperity or economic well-being, and not necessarily growth. But the rest, I think, are all things that we all agree are part of this sustainable well-being future. Urgent action on climate, protecting our natural capital assets, no poverty, no hunger, better reduced inequalities, etc. I'm sure you've all seen this picture. But I'm sure that most Australians have probably not seen this picture, and I think that's part of the problem. How do we get this discussion going on a broader scale? We published a book recently where we asked several thought leaders to write essays and say what do they think a sustainable and desirable future looks like. So you can take a look at that collection if you're interested. There's also the process of scenario planning, which has become quite useful in many different contexts, and also at the global scale. This is the scenarios that were done by the Great Transition Initiative, and that's been going on for quite a while. And they're sort of archetypical scenarios in the scenario planning game, where there's, in this case, there's the business as usual scenario that continues to focus on GDP growth, and the policy reform scenario, which continues also to focus on GDP growth, but has more of a community orientation. And the Great Transition scenario, which focuses on well-being and at the community scale. The Fortress world is focusing on well-being, but at the individual scale. So recognizing or presenting these sorts of scenarios, and I think the SDGs sort of fall into that category of Great Transition type scenarios, But how do we present them? How do we engage the broader public in understanding that there is a choice to be made, and that we have to decide, what kind of world do we really want? How do you present that? How do you present these alternatives? You can do that visually, so here's those scenarios sort of with a graphic that kind of encapsulates what that kind of world would be like. But I think we need to go a lot further. We need to engage the arts and humanities communities. We need to have movies and TV shows and things that are set in a more sustainable and desirable future. You may have seen the movie 2040, which is one of that type, but they're very rare. Most movies these days are in dystopias of the future, not in positive transitions. But how do we get that sort of discussion going in the general public? One thing we did was a public opinion survey of over 2,000 Australians, where we presented them with these 4 visions of the future, in short narratives. We changed the names slightly to be a little less value laden. So instead of the Great Transition, which who could be against that? We said community well-being, which is what it's really about. Free enterprise, coordinated action, strong individualism instead of fortress world. And then we had a survey. These were the results of that survey, and you could see that by far, and this was a random sample or a representative sample of Australians. 72% ranked the sustainable well-being as number 1 or number 2 in their preferences. We also asked them where they thought the country was headed, and by far they said the free enterprise scenario was where things were going. So. But I think we could do a lot more with this sort of therapy. How do we begin to engage the general public in thinking about and discussing and sort of building a shared vision of the kind of world that we want? The pushback you'll get is, well, we can't have a world without growth, right? Well, obviously we can. There's been several interesting studies, and most of human history has been a world without growth. So we know that it's possible. But more recently, there's been a couple of good books about one by Peter Victor called Managing Without Growth, and one by Tim Jackson called Prosperity Without Growth. They go into a lot of detail on this. Peter Victor did a computer model of the Canadian economy and asked that question explicitly. Can you have an economy that's not growing, that does provide all of the kinds of things that we would like to see? And you could certainly have a no growth disaster if you just shut off GDP and don't change anything else. But you could also have a better low or no growth positive economy. And he came up with 12 policies that you need to change. So here's the 12-step program for the therapy to overcome our addiction to growth. First of all, we need new meanings and measures of success. We need something like GPI versus GDP, or a sustainable well-being kind of measure to guide the process. We need limits on materials, energy, waste, and land use. So we need to stay within planetary boundaries, basically, in terms of our resource consumption and all of those things. We need more meaningful prices. The market is not telling us the truth about anything that we buy these days because of all the environmental and social externalities attached to it. So if we embedded those costs into the prices, I think things would be better. We need more durable, more repairable products. The goal is to satisfy our needs, not to produce and consume more just simply for the sake of production and consumption. So that might lower GDP, but actually it would meet our needs better. We need fewer status goods and more community goods. So the purpose of the economy should move away from simply status seeking and towards actually meeting our needs sufficiently, and allowing more time for community interaction and the things that actually do contribute to our own well-being and our community and planetary well-being. More informative advertising. We should recognize that a lot of advertising these days is to make people feel unhappy and convince them that the only way they can be happy is by buying more stuff. We need advertising that just says what the product does and not doesn't try to change people's perceptions. We need better screening of technology. Technology is a good servant, but a poor master. So we don't want to follow technology wherever it leads. We want to direct the technology to meet our actual needs. We need more efficient capital stock. That's the corollary of the consumption goods. So we don't want capital stock that deteriorates unnecessarily simply so we can build more. We need more local and less global. And this is more to build local economies and local community. And also to reduce the costs of transportation. not necessarily, we need sort of global communication, but in terms of production and consumption, more local and less global. We need reduced inequality. This is an obvious component of reduced well-being, and as we showed in the GPI, and there have been several other studies that show that the more unequal society is, the higher a whole range of social problems are, and the lower the quality of life. So if our goal is sustainable well-being, reducing inequality is a must. We need less work and more leisure, and this was brought up in the earlier discussion. Our work-life balance needs to be better adjusted, and a lot of what we're producing should be for the purpose of improving our well-being, not necessarily just to make money to buy stuff that we don't really need. And finally, we need education for life and not just work. So education should be about telling people or engaging people with a discussion of what actually does contribute to well-being. And not just to find a job to make money and buy stuff we don't really need. So how do we get this done? Well, one thing that's happening in a positive way, I think, is the formation of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of groups, individuals around the world that are all thinking similar thoughts, but they're not coordinated. There are the social justice groups and the sustainable economy groups and the environmental groups. How do we bring all of those groups together and build an alliance that's strong enough to actually help move the system in the right way? There are a few governments that have gotten involved in this. The Wellbeing Economy Governments Group that was initiated in 2018 by Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. I encourage you to watch her TED Talk about this. I think it's really good that a head of state, has begun to think this way. Certainly. Next door, Jacinda Ardern and the well-being budget that they've established for New Zealand, and recognizing that we need to address social well-being, not just the economic well-being. So it's moving in that direction. Iceland has also gone forward with that sort of thing, and Finland, I think, has also recently joined the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So take a look at the website for We All, and if you're so inclined to join the movement and to help others join the movement. The time is now, really. I think the current sort of spate of crises that we're still involved with allows us to think about doing things in a different way. So how can we build back better so that we're not pursuing the same mindless pursuit of GDP. And that's deteriorating our social and our environmental quality of life, and is really depleting our real wealth. So thank you very much. Okay, how do I stop sharing now? Let's see. There we go.
Thanks, Bob. That was terrific. Really appreciated how much you got through in such a short amount of time. My question is, in a country like Australia, which is fabulously wealthy but full of people who don't believe they're wealthy, people are frightened, people feel like they're barely making ends meet, even though, as it goes globally, we are amongst the very wealthiest people on the entire planet. How do we make this change happen when people are so comfy but so unaware of just how comfortable we are? How do we get the shifts you're talking about to actually happen? I mean, you don't need me to tell you what our government is like. Our government is in place because people are scared and feel threatened of the other and really uncertain of change. So how do you convince a population like ours?
Well, I think that gets back to the addiction analogy. It is hard to change. And so we shouldn't expect that we're going to get these changes simply by pointing out that, we're headed in the wrong direction and we could be doing things so much better. So the first step in that therapy is really, okay, let's not talk about the elephant, let's talk about what kind of world do we want. And I think in my experience, when you have that discussion and you put the marker far enough in the future and you say, what kind of world do we want, for our children, basically, you get much more consensus out of people. And once you've established that and said, our real goal is not to continue growing GDP, nobody really wants or needs that. Once you understand, what it is and what the implications are. So if you can build that consensus first, I think that can help then to motivate the kinds of changes that we're looking for. And that's what we haven't been pursuing. And to me, the essence of democracy really should be about building a shared vision of the kind of world we want. That's kind of our first step. And we sort of had that at some points in the past, but I think we don't have that ongoing discussion as part of the process. It's assumed that everyone's on board with the conventional goals, and so when you have that discussion with politicians or individuals who are still in that mindset of that's what the goal is, just keep the economy growing. Anything that gets in the way of that has got to be bad. That's not you're never going to have a meeting of the minds. So you have to get those people and everyone else to sit down together in a room and say, okay, now what kind of world do we really want? I don't know how to do that exactly. I wish I did. I think public opinion surveys could ask that kind of question instead of asking people just what policies do they support now. But I think it's going to take a bit more than that. It's going to take some really clever kind of movies, engagement processes. I don't know. I'll leave it to you guys if you have any great ideas on how do you actually convene that kind of global, shared vision exercise. The SDGs kind of did that at the policy level, but like I said, maybe you could take a guess. I'd like to see a survey on this. So, like, what percentage of the Australian population has actually ever even heard of the SDGs, much less, sort of bought into them? I would guess it's probably a pretty small percentage, but that would be one way to start there. How do you get that message out and get people to understand that, hey, we've already committed to this broader set of goals as a country, but no one even knows about it.
Thanks for that. I just had a question as well. And I was curious what you thought the role of educating young people in this kind of thing, and how that's going to affect the future, where it seems like talking to my parents or my grandparents, it's much more difficult to convince them of anything than it is to someone else my age. And how maybe we can get some of these ideas in school systems or in university more, so that the people that are growing up can make the change, and help educate everyone else.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge part of the issue, and I think it's going to take, and I think you're seeing a lot of that now from the younger generation, with the climate emergency group, and I think like you say, older people's minds are harder to change. They are kind of locked in and addicted to the system since they've been at it for so long. So yeah, I think that's an important part of it. However, are universities really supporting that kind of thing, or are they sort of also locked into supporting the standard kind of education, where people are educated to get a job rather than educated to actually improve societal well-being? Part of it could be how we change how we change work. This idea of universal basic income or universal basic support, I think, could have a major impact on that kind of thing. If you didn't have to work and take on huge debt to go to university, if that were supported in different ways, I think that's, or having the right, everyone having the right to go to university relatively unencumbered. I mean, Australia is not too bad in that regard with the income contingent loan system, but it could be better.
Yeah, I just wondered if you would, with work-related things, if you had priced things that people buy and the amount of hours of life that they're wasting instead of the actual price of the item, how different their spending would be. So based on how much they make per hour, if they're buying something just, something they don't need, if it was said the label of the amount of life you're losing just purchasing this thing, if they would spend things differently.
Absolutely, I think they would. And also the other externalities attached to production and consumption. So there's all the environmental externalities, all the social externalities. The price of goods would be very different than it is now. And I think if that were the case, it would certainly change people's buying behavior significantly. Just pricing carbon, for example, would be a good thing. If you really, let's use those sort of market pricing signals to get the kind of behavior that we want. But the reason it's not being used is because of lobbying by the fossil fuel sector, and they're kind of locked into trying to protect their stranded assets at all costs. There's a really good video you could watch if you go on YouTube and search for Australians for Coal. There's a satirical video that was done several years ago, but it's right on the mark.
Hi, Robert. My name's Liam. Thank you so much about your talk. Very inspirational. I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the therapy side. I've been studying nature-based leadership, and one of the angles we've gone across with therapy was grief ceremonies, where people actually come forward and express a lot of taboo emotions about their living situations, about the world, so that it can be held in the way it's like a mass therapy approach, where authentic expression is both witnessed and inspired in people, so that they can go, actually, I'm in a really bad situation, even though I'm earning 100K a year, and there's all these things that people are hiding away. Do you think that's sort of aligned to the type of therapy you need to work towards, or not quite?
I think that's part of it, but that's still at the individual scale. And I think the problem is that as a society, we're addicted to the current structure, and that's why it's very hard for people, to change the system simply by changing their individual behavior. So we have to actually change the system. Now, historically, that often requires that the system collapse before you can rebuild it into some other form. I don't think we necessarily have to go that far, but I think it does take a crisis to wake up, to allow the system to be at least restructured from a certain perspective. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It's a pretty good answer for it. Perhaps on this scale, it would have been if this was expanded out to be standard practice as opposed to just individual groups of people being authentically expressing.
If you could get the whole community, to participate in that, and that would be a community-wide recognition, that yes, we are addicted to the current system, and then that would motivate some positive changes. But then again, that recognition is still just one step, and I think the next step is really okay. Once we've acknowledged we're yes, we need the therapy. What kind of therapy is there, and how do we best utilize what we know about what works at other scales? And so, from that, my interpretation of this motivational interviewing strategy is you've got to really get people to think outside their current situation and say what kind of life, what kind of world do they want, and use that to help motivate the difficult changes that are required to get from here to there. And it does work at many different scales, even at the business scale. That's an often used strategy, to say we need to re-envision what the business is going to look like. That sort of motivates the kind of changes that are necessary to help get there. And it's certainly been used at the smaller community scales as well. But so it's, I think, an effective strategy and therapy But implementing that in a broader, sort of national, international scale, I think is the challenge.
Thank you so much, Bob. This is Sophie, who actually reached out to you to get you here at NewKind. And I just want to thank you for sharing your insights and all your wisdom with us today. We're really, really grateful and so lucky to have you here. So a massive thank you. I'm just conscious of time because we're on a break at the moment. We're about to start our next panel in about 10 minutes. So I think we'll end it there. And yeah, I just actually one last question. If anyone wanted to pursue a career in ecological economics or study further in terms of well-being economics, what would be your recommendation for how to start that process, bearing in mind that there isn't really a degree in Australia right now that is in ecological economics, and it tends to be the traditional environmental economics degrees.
Right. Well, I don't know if you noticed the empty bookcases behind me, but I'm moving to University College London in January. So that would be one place to go to get a degree in ecological economics. And there are several places in Europe and the United States. I think that like the University of Vermont, where I was previously, has an ongoing program, and there's several others. Australia, yeah, you're right, not so much. It's one of the reasons I'm not staying here. But there is an Australian hub of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that you could join, and so certainly that would be a way to go. But there are several individuals who are doing this kind of work. So yeah, you could look them up.
Okay, will do. Thank you so much, and please try and push for UCL to do some sort of remote learning degree or something so we can all participate.
Will do. All right.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Bob.
you.
Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.